Okay, good afternoon. My name is Mona Ateya. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at the George Washington University, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Dear Palestine, A Social History of the 1948 War, a conversation between Shay Hazkani and Shira Robinson. Um, we are really just delighted and lucky to have Shay Hazkani here with us as a visiting scholar and sabbatical fellow this year at the Institute for Middle East Studies. He is also associate professor of history and Jewish studies at the University of Maryland College Park. His work specializes on the social and cultural history of Palestine in Israel. His first book, which we're discussing today, Dear Palestine, A Social History of the 1948 War, was published by Stanford University Press in 2021 and was the recipient of the Kornblatt and Azrieli Concordia Book Awards and longlisted for the Kundal History Prize. The book is also slated to be published in Hebrew and in Arabic this year. He's the co-creator of The Soldier's Opinion, which is a documentary film based on his research. The film also was a recipient of the 2023 American Historical Association John E. Connor Film Award. And he'll be in conversation today with our IMUS's very own Shira Robinson, who's Associate Professor of History and International Affairs here at GW. She works on the social and cultural history of the modern Middle East with an emphasis on colonialism, citizenship, nationalism, and cultures of militarism after World War I. Her first book, Citizen Strangers, Palestinians and the Birth of Israel's Liberal Settler State, examines Israel's imposition of military rule on the Palestinian Arabs who remained within its borders after 1948. The book won a 2014 Outstanding Academic Title Award sponsored by Choice and was listed as one of its top 25 academic books of the year. Just before I hand the floor to Shira, I want to thank Christian Clinton for all his support and Matthew, our work study student, for his support with the event. And thanks so much for being here. Shira.
Great. Thank you so much, Mona. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Again, my name is Shira Robinson, and I've been teaching history and international affairs at GW and affiliated with the Institute for Middle East Studies since 2007. I am delighted to be in conversation with Shay Hazkani today about his new book. Shay, thank you for joining us to discuss your extraordinary book.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with you, even in those tragic and apocalyptic times.
Yeah, so we'll get to the apocalyptic times in a few minutes. Let me just open by saying that Dear Palestine offers an entirely new perspective on the 1948 war, which marked the culmination of the decades-long struggle of the Zionist movement, a European Jewish nationalist settler colonial project to establish a Jewish majority state in Palestine, a place that in the late 19th century was inhabited by an overwhelmingly Arab Palestinian population. Now, as many of the participants in this webinar know, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was made possible only by the forced displacement and dispossession of roughly 80% of Palestine's indigenous Arabs from the large part of the country that Israel conquered, about 78% of Palestine. Palestinians refer to the social, political, cultural, and human cataclysm that occurred in 1948 as the Nakba, or catastrophe, which turned over half of all Palestinians from the river to the sea, as it were, of some 750,000 Palestinians into refugees living in makeshift camps and in Lebanon, Syria, and the newly enlarged territories of Jordan, which annexed the West Bank after 1948, and Egypt, which took over the administration of Gaza after 1948. I have been studying and teaching the history of 1948 and the broader struggle for land and power in Israel-Palestine for over 20 years. About 15 years ago, Palestinian scholars and activists and others began using the term ongoing Nakba to describe Israel's relentless assault since 1948 against the Palestinian right to return or stay in their homes and lands, their right to live in dignity, in freedom and security, and their right to determine their own future. This term, when I first saw it, made immediate sense to me. I have spent my entire academic career studying the ways in which Israel's fear of the reversal of the Nakba, as well as the territorial and demographic gains it made after 1967, has shaped virtually every aspect of Israel's political life, its legal system, its economic structures, its public culture, and its national identity. Now, Gazans have been subjected to multiple wars since Israel pulled out in 2005. But the particular war that we are witnessing in Gaza today, and to a certain extent in the West Bank, those primarily the worst of it is in Gaza. The particular war that we're witnessing today began in response to the heinous and murderous Hamas attack of October 7th that killed over 1,200 people and led to the abduction of some 240 more. But over the last 6 months, Israel's ferocious response to the Hamas attack has challenged, or at least strained, to my mind, the framing of the ongoing Nakba. We are seeing evidence of this challenge in the professional media and on social media. The term ongoing implies continuity, even steadiness, and this term is inadequate, in my opinion, and in the opinions of some others, to capture the unprecedented scope and pace of Israel's current campaign of murder, destruction, ethnic cleansing, and starvation of the Palestinian people in Gaza, a campaign that we have watched unfold on our screens in real time. As of yesterday, Israeli bombs, tanks, and snipers have killed over 33,000 Palestinians in Gaza, and more likely over 40,000 once we count the people that will be found under the rubble. It has wounded over 75,000 more people, many with life-altering injuries. Over half of these casualties have been children and women. Israeli forces have deliberately destroyed the entire healthcare system and damaged or destroyed hundreds of schools and all 12 universities in Gaza. They have targeted medical staff, journalists, humanitarian aid workers, engineers, professors, and more. And Israel is now using starvation as a weapon of war, blocking aid that it could easily get in. In the assessment of the International Court of Justice in late January, Israel's actions, coupled with its declarations of intent, have met the threshold of plausible genocide. So years from now, I suspect, or at least wonder, if Palestinians and others will be continuing to debate how to frame the apocalyptic destruction of Palestinian life and society in Gaza that we are currently witnessing unfold in terms of continuity and rupture, continuity and an escalation of the ongoing Nakba, or in fact, Nakba 2023, as Avi Dichter, the Minister of Agriculture and member of Israel's Security Cabinet, referred to Israel's campaign in November of 2023. I wanted to open this conversation with an acknowledgement of the present moment for 2 reasons. One, because this human-made catastrophe requires our immediate attention and sustained attention. And 2, because the questions that we ask about the past and the way we think about it are necessarily filtered through the present. This fact, this condition is inescapable. And the most pressing analytical question that came up for me when rereading your book, Shay, is how we can make sense of 2023 in light of 1948. That is, how we can understand the historical conditions that got us from one Nakba to the other, or to another.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, did you want to say something?
No. Please continue.
Okay. Dear Palestine is not another political or military history of 1948, and for good reason. For many decades, scholars and political leaders disputed the structural conditions and contingent events that converged to produce the Nakba and the establishment of the State of Israel. Israel, for many decades, claimed that it bore no responsibility for what it euphemistically referred to as the Arab exodus. Instead, the Israeli government said the displacement of Palestinians in 1948 was the result of flight prompted by the instructions of Arab political leaders so that their armies could supposedly drive the Jews into the sea. The Israeli government also said that the outcome of the war was a miracle. Palestinians, by contrast, long claimed that the forces of the Yishuv, or Jewish settler community in Palestine, and later the Israeli army, drove them out so that Israel could steal their lands. Palestinians pointed to the decades of colonial settlement and with the support of the British Empire and later the League of Nations, and the United Nations that enabled the Zionist movement to build up the infrastructure for a state, which rendered the outcome of the war more predictable than not. Palestinians also pointed to the cynicism, political rivalries, mutual suspicions, and military weaknesses that shaped the disastrous performance of the Arab armies to prevent partition. I am simplifying here, but starting in the 1980s, research by Jewish Israeli historians who gained privileged access to previously classified archival material in the state and military archives largely confirmed the parameters of the Palestinian narrative about 1948. And the result was that by the early 2000s, scholars more or less stopped having anything to debate over in terms of the question of who was responsible for the Nakba and how it was carried out. Scholars also agreed that they also came to a consensus that Israel enjoyed the overwhelming military superiority in terms of manpower, training, equipment, and funding during the fighting that lasted 20 months. Now, the scholarship on Palestine-Israel or Israel-Palestine has rapidly matured over the last quarter century, and it has mostly moved on from the history of the war itself. Although scholars have moved in multiple directions, I would propose that at least 4 methodological imperatives unify the field. Number 1, the first imperative or mission of the field as it is coming to be shaped and recognized as such is of the need to situate the conflict in Israel-Palestine in a global historical context. In other words, to stop treating the Zionist movement and the Palestinian response to it as an exception to the larger trends of nationalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, national liberation struggles, racism, the civil rights struggle, and more. A second imperative that seems to be taken for granted by scholars in the field now is the need to disaggregate Palestinians and Jews as homogeneous groups with preformed identities that were necessarily opposed to each other in all contexts. A third imperative would be the rejection of the hard and fast chronological boundaries that used to mark the literature. In other words, the 1948 to 1967 period is totally different from the period that preceded it and followed it. And other chronological boundaries have been muddied by historians and scholars. And there has been an insistence in the last 25 years on seeing the history of Zionism and the question of Palestine over the longue durée of the late 19th century to the present. Finally, there has been a recognition among most scholars of Israel-Palestine that to the best of their abilities, researchers should work in both languages in order to understand the complexity of the struggle over land and power in the region. That is both Hebrew and Arabic. All 4 of these charges inform Shay Hazkani's book, which demonstrates that there is in fact much more to say about the war and its immediate aftermath than even I was led to believe, or even I thought. And it does this by chronicling these 20 months of fighting from the perspective of the soldiers who fought in it. The book specifically looks at soldiers from 2 armies. On one side, you had the Haganah, the Israeli Yishuv armed militia, which became the core of the Israeli army, or the IDF. And this included, on the Haganah side and then the Israeli army side after May 1948, 23,000 Holocaust survivors, several thousand volunteers from North African Jewish communities, including especially Morocco, as well as volunteers, several thousand volunteers from the West, especially the United States. Shay, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the total number of forces that were fighting on the Haganah side was about 50,000.
At the height of the war, about 88,000. That's the highest number that it reached.
Okay, great. Thank you for that correction. And in addition to the Haganah and the Israeli army, Shay also looks at the Arab Liberation Army, which he'll talk about, but which was dispatched or created by the foreign ministers that made up the Arab countries that belonged to the Arab League, and which recruited this was before the Arab invasion of Palestine, ostensibly to thwart the partition in May 1948, In December of 1947 already, this Arab Liberation Army was conceived of and started to recruit and ultimately recruited roughly 5,000 volunteers from Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, perhaps Yemen, Shay will tell us, and Palestine. To tell this story, Shay draws on previously untapped archival documents, including propaganda distributed to soldiers to indoctrinate them on what they were fighting for and how they should conduct themselves on the battlefield, as well as letters that soldiers wrote home to their friends and family. Shay's analysis of both the educational material and the soldiers' letters reveal fascinating parallels between the soldiers on the quote-unquote Arab side and the Jewish side, including the ways that the nationalism that motivated them was rooted in a culture of militarism stemming from their internalization of racist stereotypes about their communities as weak or inferior. And he uncovers significant fault lines, ideological, cultural, racial, and political fault lines within both groups of soldiers. So Shay, having said all of that, can you start off by describing the sources that you used for this book and the journey that you took to track them down, and then offer us a brief snapshot of the central parallels and fault lines that your work uncovers?
Yeah, thank you so much, Shia, for this wonderful introduction and setting up the context of what we're talking about, both the context of 48 and the context of the current apocalypse. I was, before switching to academia, I was a journalist on Israeli television and radio, covering the occupied territories and the Israeli military. Maybe we'll get to some of that later on. At some point in time, I was working in the archives of the Israel Defense Forces. That's a peculiar place. I know you know that well as well, in sort of a militarized compound. Back in the days, you could not bring your cell phone or anything like that into the room. And I was researching one of an interesting historical episode that I wanted to do something for the evening news for, about the first arms deal between Israel and West Germany in the 1950s, where Israel had sold these Uzi rifles to the German army. That was a big deal because that was less than a decade after the extermination of most European Jews by Nazi Germany. And both inside the army and outside the army, there was a lot of resentment and anger at this decision to sell arms to Germany. And as I was looking through those documents, I found this very peculiar memo by one army bureaucrat to his superior saying, by the way, if you may be interested to know, there's also significant dissent among Israeli soldiers. And we know this because we secretly read and intercept their personal letters before they're delivered to the recipients. And if you want to see what they think about this arms deal in their letters, I refer you to The Soldier's Opinion. It's a kind of a publication put out by the army every 2 weeks where you can read copies of their personal letters. And I was really intrigued. I've never heard of anything like that. Later, I found this was a common practice in the British Empire, in the US, and elsewhere. And I started asking around and quickly found out that this operation existed from 1948 up to 1998. And I later found out that it encompassed much more than Israeli Jewish soldiers. It also intercepted letters by Palestinians, by Jews from all around the world, and we can talk more about those groups later. I asked to see some of those sources, and it was an ongoing request. It took over a decade, all in all, to get some of these sources declassified. And I really remember this moment of sitting at the archives and looking through that publication called The Soldier's Opinion. One of the first letters that I saw, and the book actually ends with that letter, is a letter by an Israeli soldier who is probably sent to blow up a depopulated Palestinian village in the late 1950s. And what he does, and I think that echoes a lot of what we see today, and certainly a lot of what happened in 48, he walks around in the partially demolished Palestinian house. And he basically has this aha moment where he said, we always were told that, we received this land because we loved it more and we're deserving of it in any way. But now when I walk around these emptied houses, I realize that there were a people here, right? They loved, they hated, And it makes him wonder what happened to them. And in fact, it made him even contest some of the propaganda and indoctrination that he was subject to inside and outside the army. And that's sort of the first letter that grabbed my attention. And I really felt that those letters told a unique story, perhaps an unknown one, of this visceral reaction that people had, ordinary people, right? I don't care much about the Ben-Gurions or the Muftis, the Amin al-Husseinis. They're part of the story, but what really captured my attention and what I was trying to tell is the kind of way that ordinary men and women that were, soldiers or the victims of the war, primarily Palestinian victims, what sense they made of reality as it was unfolding. But it's not a romantic story, right? We sometimes think, oh, soldier's letter, this is a romanticization of army life. Not at all. Some of these letters, describe war crimes and of various sorts and certainly suffering, I thought, beyond imagination. But of course, the last 6 months have taught us differently on that question. And so I started looking at them, and it became apparent to me very quickly that he really can talk about those sides that were often, and I do that myself because that's sort of a short writing sort of way of talking about 48 and the quote unquote conflict. But when I kept reading those letters closer and closer, and over the many, many years I worked on this, I was also able to get letters of Palestinians who became refugees in 48 and were corresponding with their families who became Israeli citizens, as well as letters by volunteers from around the Arab world. And I found these really interesting redrawn lines that I had not thought about. And let me end this answer by reading a very, very short paragraph about the kind of new lines that I thought are being sort of in a way redrawn by these letters. So I said basically what I'm reading here for a paragraph here in the introduction. It's not only the Arab Jew binary that this book seeks to destabilize. Some of these seemingly opposing subgroups that I talk about actually had similar experiences in 1948, like young Arabs and Jews from the middle classes who were attracted to militarism, or Palestinians and Mizrahi Jews who both wished to return to their former homeland, Palestinians to Palestine and Moroccan Jews to Morocco. But 48 not only occasioned conflicts and parallels between free-formed groups who had made their way to Palestine, the war also rendered these categories meaningful in the first place, as its participants discovered what it meant to have their identity reduced to Jew or Arab, in some cases for the first time. And that's the kind of messier story that I sought to tell in the book. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted so I wouldn't clear my throat and interrupt your answer. Can you offer us a few specific anecdotes, like maybe about the Moroccan Jews or about anything you want from your book that you think is that most struck you when you were doing your research, to kind of elaborate on what your book does?
Sure. So again, I look at these very different groups, and a few of them, I'll give one that I found very, very interesting in terms of the kind of propaganda directed at them if in the process of the mobilization, and then an example from the kind of discussion that I found in letters. First of all, in terms of propaganda, I look at the mobilization of Jews and Arabs around the world, right? It's a global war in that way. And you mentioned over 20,000 Holocaust survivors. And so one of the things I did was to really look closely at the kind of propaganda disseminated in DP camps, right, where Holocaust survivors were concentrated in the European continent in the aftermath of the Second World War. And the kind of propaganda the Zionist movement and later the State of Israel directed at them to try and get them not only to come to the land of Israel, but also enlist in the IDF and fight, literally months after surviving the Nazi genocidal campaign. And that kind of propaganda, it was actually pretty shocking and very emotional to read, right? So basically they're telling these people, and that's literally written in that language, a second Holocaust is taking place in Palestine, right? This time the Arabs as the descendants and etc. We can talk more about that kind of propaganda of the Nazis. They're going to completely exterminate the Jews, and it is therefore your duty, you Holocaust survivor, to come and fight to save those Jews who had survived the Nazi extermination campaign. That kind of propaganda and mobilization was very, very effective. And certainly, we see how that plays out in the war itself. Another group that I look at extensively are these Moroccan Jews. And this is a very unique story because in Morocco, this is the largest concentration of Jews in the Arab world and in North Africa, 250,000 in 1948. And about a couple of thousands of them are mobilized and enter the IDF. And I follow them through their personal letters that were intercepted by this intelligence apparatus throughout the war. And it's really interesting to see how initially they are very excited by the prospects of this Jewish state because they see it as an end to this dhimmi status. That's a classic Islamic term that refers to the protected but also subordinated status of Jews in sort of the Islamic empire. And that idea survived in very few places by the 20th century. One of them was Morocco. And so initially, there is excitement about Jews, holding arms, being allowed, so basically flipping that dhimmi status on its head and becoming now in a place of superiority. But very quickly, before the end of the war in 1949, those Moroccan soldiers in the IDF start suffering from racism, primarily by their Ashkenazi counterparts. And you see that process of disenchantment in the letters very, very closely. And that process of racialization of those Moroccan Jews causes some of them to really become disenchanted with Zionism themselves, to the degree that some of them start identifying Morocco's Arab population, and to a degree also the Arabs of Palestine, as quote-unquote brothers rather than Ashkenazi Jews, right? And 70% of them, according to statistics collected by that intelligence apparatus that was reading their letters, wanted to leave Israel and return to Morocco at the end of the war. And I'll give one last example of a group that I look at, and I try to sort of connect all of them in a more seamless way in the book itself, are Sabra Jews, right? Obviously an important group. These are Jews that were born in Palestine to parents or grandparents that had immigrated mostly from Eastern Europe, right? And we need to remember that the Zionist movement is not a monolith, not today, but certainly not in the late 19th and into the first half of the 20th century. And we can talk more maybe about this disappearance of what I would certainly call humanist Zionism. Whether it was inevitable or not, that's a different discussion. But that kind of indoctrination that was directed at soldiers, also Sabra soldiers, that basically told them, yeah, you need to depopulate this country because otherwise there is no way that a Jewish state could emerge. That kind of indoctrination and propaganda was sometimes resisted. Again, obviously overwhelmingly eventually was accepted, but some of the letters that I found most interesting was letters of those who doubted, who sought to challenge or at least had a second thought about that kind of dehumanization and racialization of the Palestinian Arab population. And one letter that I quote in the book is a letter by a female combat soldier in 1948 that, witnesses some really horrific war crimes perpetrated by her friends, right? The burning of a Syrian soldier and some other atrocities. And she has this very interesting letter to the family where she says, she grapples with this question of what she considered the Jewish tradition should regard the killing of both combatants and civilians in the context of the war. And she said, she grapples with it. She goes back and forth in the letters, and she ends by saying, I think that if the Jewish guys are expected to fight and murder legitimately, like the soldiers of other nations, they too should be allowed to erupt and kill just like that out of revenge and pleasure. At first, it was hard for me to believe and get used to the idea that a Jewish soldier from a good kosher home can abuse people in such a horrific way. The last battles taught me a lot and opened my eyes. And so by really stating that Jews should be like all other nations, right, the soldier was actually making an ideological choice on one of the oldest debates inside the Zionist movement that dates back to the 19th century. And it's then that we find these sort of two distinct strands, one that sided with becoming a nation like all other nations, which is, of course, a verse from the Bible. And the core idea there was to imitate the populist, chauvinist nationalism that was so popular in Europe at the turn of the century. And among other things, celebrate the use of force. The other strand that is often referred to as light unto nation, again, a verse from Isaiah, is this idea that openly rejected the use of force as means of advancing Zionist goals and instead emphasized the moral aspects of Judaism and what its adherers saw as the supposed universal message, so-called light on the nation. And by stating that the battles opened her eyes, it would seem that the writer sort of came to accept that violence was constitutive to the creation of this new Jewish nation. And of course, some of these voices reverberate up to the present moment.
Thank you so much. And I want to get more to the question of indoctrination and messaging in a minute, but I wonder if you could just offer a brief reflection or analysis for our listeners this afternoon and viewers of how these fault lines emerged on the side of the Arab Liberation Army. If you could just talk a little bit about the ALA, because I didn't do it justice.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. The ALA is a creation of the Arab League, but it's also not a creation of the Arab League. It's not a creation of the Arab League because there was popular mobilization for Palestine all around not just the Arab and Islamic world, but even elsewhere in 1948, where tens and tens of thousands initially registered their name to volunteer to come and defend Palestinians, abrogate the partition decision, etc. And it's actually the Arab League and the creation of this Arab Liberation Army, or Jaysh al-Inqadh al-Arabi, as it's called in Arabic, that actually curtailed that kind of mobilization, right? So the volunteer army was established by Shukri al-Kawatli, the Syrian president, with all sorts of aims in mind. One of them was to help Palestinians, but another aim was to secure his grip on power. And the reason that we see that only about 5,000 of the tens of thousands, 30, 40,000, that's just the numbers that I've collected, but probably more, that initially registered, made their way to Palestine, was because of the Arab regime's attempt to sort of both control the mobilization and make sure that it's used in a way that will not hinder their grip on power. And so those 5,000 make it to Palestine under the command of Fawzi al-Kawukji, Lebanese, who was this anti-colonial fighter, one of the most famous in the 20th century. And then they fight alongside Palestinians from about December to May, alongside the Army of the Holy Jihad, which is a primarily Palestinian militia in the country. It is and it's not an army. It has shown some relatively serious military engagement at some very specific parts in the early period, but by and large, it was not trained well. It did not have sufficient arms and weapons, etc., etc. And much of the country, much of Arab Palestine, is actually erased, and certainly hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees actually are either expelled or flee the country before the invasion of the Arab regular armies in May. So in some ways, it is a very, very consequential, even though they were not a major army force. And their kind of relationship, it's very interesting because, again, there's a major difference between the elites and non-elites, right? The Arab leaders have one thing in mind, one of the things that they're trying to do, right? So they tell their recruitments, oh, these are dhimmi Jews that have that are trying to basically gain sovereignty and have to be fought against and put in their place. But they're very concerned about talking about colonialism more broadly, right? Because there's a fear that the Arab volunteers would connect the fight against the British Empire and the Zionist movement in Palestine to the kind of internal colonialism that haven't really ended in those countries. Some of them are now nominally independent in the 40s, but are largely still controlled by British and France. And so that kind of propaganda and indoctrination on that side is curtailed by that. But then you have those volunteers themselves, and I was really fortunate to find several hundreds of those letters by people coming from Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Palestinians themselves. And they see the reality very differently, right? And in fact, once they understand that the aim of this Arab Liberation Army may not just be to liberate Palestine, but have other agendas in mind, they try to create these almost personal connections with the Palestinians on the ground. Obviously, that doesn't lead to much, but we definitely see that as well during the war.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me about this part of your book was the ways in which the Iraqi government, which again had been nominally sovereign since 1932, but which was still ruled by a proxy family for the British Empire, the Hashemites. And one of the things that struck me was the ways in which they sent or dispatched volunteers to Syria to be trained by the ALA because they wanted to deflect attention and criticism from the oil agreement that they had just signed or tried to sign with the British, with the Iraqi Petroleum Company, whose majority shares were owned by Britain, and the ways in which people were connecting. The soldiers were upset about what was happening in Iraq, but they were also connected to the Palestinian question.
Yeah, so Palestine could mean a lot of people, and we see that also today, right? We talk a lot about Palestine, the place, versus Palestine, the cause. The two do interact, but they also diverge. That's also not something that is new. And so for a lot of those, both those who mobilized Arab volunteers and Jewish volunteers, so that's a different story, but both those who mobilized them and for volunteers themselves, the fight in Palestine against the British and the Zionist movement meant all sorts of things. And so that's really interesting because we know that in the historiography, especially Zionist historiography, but not only, it's often presented as, oh, well, the Arab Liberation Army and the Army of the Holy Jihad, these are, ISIS-like jihadists. And actually, when you read those letters, you see that it is a far, far more complicated story. Of course, that should not surprise us, but, it was really interesting and to try and present some of those views that in the letters and understand what was motivating these individuals.
Yeah, and I wanted to just talk a little bit more about this question of the indoctrination materials. One of the book's most haunting chapters is about just these materials that were distributed to soldiers about their mission and about their expected conduct in the field. And on the one hand, you debunk longstanding claims that Arab commanders instructed their troops to kill Jews per se, or for the sake of killing Jews, or to drive them into the sea. And you say that you find no meaningful evidence of anti-Semitism in the ALA materials. By contrast, the dehumanization that you describe of Palestinians and the exterminationist sentiment that you describe as coming out of the materials being distributed to Haganah and then Israeli soldiers, and the talks that they were given by education officers to kind of mobilize them and whip them up for the fight against Palestinians, the dehumanization of Palestinians on the Israeli side is kind of overwhelming to read about. Can you talk about some of your key findings on this front?
Yeah. So, that was a surprising finding, to be completely honest. Everyone who had grown up in Israel, and I think also in many English and probably French-speaking countries as well, will be familiar with this idea that one of the main aims of the Arab side of Palestinians, of the Arab armies in 1948, was to push Jews into the sea. First of all, you see that in Israeli Zionist propaganda already during the 48 war itself. So Ben Gurion talks about that being the Arab war aim already in 48. and being able to work in Arabic and as well as Hebrew sources, I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of these pamphlets, not just distributed by the Arab Liberation Army, but also by the Palestinian militia forces in 48 to try and locate that kind of propaganda. And I was largely unable to find it. Again, there is certainly violent propaganda of various sorts, but that kind of calls I was unable to find. And in fact, when you look at people like Abba Kovner, right, the education officer of the Givati Brigade, and the kind of propaganda that he uses on the southern fort, he literally says, we need to push the Egyptian into the sea and calls to slaughter the enemy, things like that. So if you actually decide to go that route of comparing that kind of propaganda, you would not certainly would not come out with the finding that Arab propaganda during the war was exterminationist. And I think that a lot of the propaganda on the Israeli Zionist side it falls much more into that camp. Now, it was more complicated than that in the sense that you found basically they were throwing anything at the soldiers that they thought could produce a result, right? Because you had these tens of thousands of Jews coming from all around the world, and you basically had to convince them that whatever their thinking and conceptualization of the Jewish tradition was, that now it's time to basically, if you are impacted by that tradition, basically now you need to be convinced that violence on a massive scale, including killing and at minimum indifference to the fate of civilian, is essential in the battlefield. And to do that, really, the kind of dehumanization and racialization of the Arab population and the Arab armies is really, really something profound, right? Not just in Abba Kovner, right? You actually find these fascinating minutes of all IDF education officers coming together during the war and discussing the question of whether it's legitimate to vilify and basically induce hatred of the Arab population and Arabs more broadly among Israeli soldiers. And it's one of the most, first of all, it was really shocking to find this discussion in the midst of the 48 war, but it was really also really interesting to see. And you have all sorts of voices. Some of them are saying, we know what slaughter is. This is literally a quote from one of the education officer, and we cannot be cavalier about this the way, for example, that Abba Kovner, one of the education officer, was. And then at the end of this, you have the chief education officer of the IDF. His name is Yosef Kalkobi, and he summarizes the discussion and basically gives his marching orders to other officers. And this is what he says at the end of this very, very interesting discussion. He says, "There's a danger that we will be overly influenced by the Jewish tradition that rules out crude hatred. We need to adjust our state of mind to the new condition. That is why we need to nurture the hate instinct. But we need to put limits to hatred. It has to be rational. We must explain to the soldiers why they have to hate the enemy, and they would hate him as long as there's a reason. That is rational hatred that fits the Jewish nature." And that sort of tension between what Kalkobi here calls rational hatred and irrational hatred, or whatever you want to frame it as, was really at the core of a lot of propaganda material during the war. And so when you look at those, you definitely, absolutely, I think, one of the questions about the 48 war historiography is that we don't find a quote-unquote smoking gun in which Ben-Gurion orders his army commanders to basically ethnic cleanse Palestine. Well, I think that looking at those kind of propaganda material that were of a very large magnitude, right? 700 plus education officer and sergeant in the IDF during the 48 war. When you look at those propaganda material, I think that need of a smoking gun, so to speak, is really not necessary, because the kind of message that they send forward is one that basically it makes it very clearly that the new Jewish state should be essentially with as few Arabs as possible. Now, that kind of claim that we started with, right, that the Arabs called to throw Jews into the sea, is one that has major lingering effect, right, even in our days. And I told you in our previous conversation that about a year ago, I had this uncivil exchange with one of the most famous columnists in Israel. His name is Ben Dor Yemini, and he writes for the Israeli Yediot Ahronot, a very popular tabloid in Israel. And I'd written a column somewhere else about archives, and in that I mentioned that I saw as basically shameful and morally corrupt his decision, that columnist, to start his weekly column by quote unquote reminding his readers that in 1948, as well as today, that's his language, the Palestinians seek to throw Jews into the sea. And basically what I argued is that malicious fabrication of history is more dangerous than others, because it will make Israeli Jews sort of entrenched in their choice of a regime of Jewish superiority under the assumption that curtain number 2 has genocide in store. Now, of course, following the apocalyptic events of October 7, that we had talked about, right, which are, what we would certainly could call pogroms, including instances of rape and mutilation. There are very few among Israeli Jews that now dispute that axiom that extermination of epic proportion, reminiscing of the Holocaust, is around the corner. If not today, then tomorrow. If not Hamas, then Hezbollah or Iran, or all together. And therefore, a very prominent sentiment that I at least capture in the Israeli society today is that only a response in kind in Gaza, that many honestly say that will include and already includes, right, massive ethnic cleansing, perhaps reaching that degree of genocide, is the only way to restore national honor, deterrence, and avert this supposed second Holocaust. And in that sense, the propaganda disseminated today, not just by official channels, but also by Israeli media and elsewhere, is really rhymes in profound ways with the one in 1948.
Thank you. And can you talk a little bit about your sense in terms of the historical record and in terms of the 1948 war and since then? Can you talk about the relationship that you can see between war and dehumanization? And what I mean by that is kind of like, how do we think about this in terms of the chicken versus the egg? I mean, I'm sure it's both, but like war clearly dehumanizes populations of one side to the other, but also the dehumanization of Palestinians began at least in 1917, if the process began at least in 1917 or even the 1880s. So you could say that the dehumanization by the Zionist movement of Palestinians built up over time. But on the other hand, you note that Jews had to be convinced to shoot Palestinians at the start of the war. And like you said, the propaganda they had to convince all these people to kind of reject their sense of what it meant to be a Jew, which included not engaging in violence and hateful acts against the so-called stranger in the Jewish liturgical tradition. Can you talk about this relationship that you see between war and dehumanization during this time period?
Yeah, and obviously it's a very challenging question of whether war begets dehumanization or dehumanization begets war, and I think in some ways it's both. And what I can say about 1948 is that the education officers had a relatively hard time, and they were even descended within the education apparatus mostly by ultra-Orthodox that were part of that institution back then. They're not today, but that were saying, this goes against any idea, right? What the secular education officers were writing in 1948, that the Arabs of the country are the descendants of Amalek and the 7 nations of Canaan, right? Those arch nemesis of the Israelites that the Bible commands to essentially exterminate, not just them, but their wife and children and sheep and cattle. You saw that kind of propaganda already in 48, but you also saw some very interesting dissent against it, both in the education apparatus and among soldiers. Now, I want to say something about the dissent among soldiers and Israelis more broadly, Israeli Jews. And the reason for that is because many had, right, those immigrants from Morocco, they knew that this is a more complicated story, right? They obviously were part of Arab culture and that kind of descent, even among Sabra Jews, right? Even among Jews that were born in man-made Palestine or in Ottoman Palestine, or those Jews who had lived before the emergence of Zionism in the country, that sort of personal contact with the Arab population at least called into question some of that dehumanization. That doesn't mean that the project was not successful at the end, because on the part of the Zionist movement, it was, right? The country was largely depopulated and Arab Palestine was erased. But what I would suggest that I mentioned earlier that the propaganda rhymes, but it's not an exact sort of carbon copy. And I think that in that sense, the emergence and the rise of religious Zionism, of Messianic Zionism after 1967, basically made it, I don't want to say impossible, but almost impossible, very challenging for the state of Israel, right, that was created out of the Zionist movement, to change course. Because now, especially after 1967, the Messianic aspect was injected into this largely initially secular or non-observant national movement. And that is, that is really a zero-sum game. And so, we see that plays out today in the sense that, many in the religious Zionist camp that are in control today of Israeli politics, even though they're just 15% of the Jewish population, right? They're in control not just of the Israeli political system or have a very strong grip on the Israeli political system, but they are very, very prominent in the IDF and in the Shin Bet, in the security establishment. So for them, for many at least, this is an opportunity, right? This apocalypse is an opportunity to reshape Israel-Palestine that may be second or similar only to the kind of opportunity, quote unquote, of 1967. And so in that sense, the dehumanization of the Arab population, of the Palestinians, etc., it not only gets these sort of supposed religious sort of reasoning, but it is much, much, much more entrenched because of the belief that there's an opportunity here to obviously decimate the Gaza Strip, but possibly ethnic cleanse much of the West Bank as well. And so that's really important. The last thing I would say is that, of course, with the modern warfare, right, the fact that you don't really see, right, those that you kill, right? And we saw this amazing piece of journalism out of 972 yesterday about the use of AI in the battlefield, right? So they know that for each Hamas militant or a traffic control officer that they kill, they will kill between 30 to 70 to 200 non-combatants, right? But they don't, that someone drops a bomb and they don't have that kind of intimate relationship with the killing of the kind that we saw in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And I think that also makes this dehumanization much, much, much more profound, because there's very little interaction of the ordinary men and women with the results of the carnage that they inflict.
Thank you. You and I have had a series of conversations over the last few weeks about this question of what's new and what's not new in terms of Zionism and sort of the ways in which Zionist leaders have used the dehumanization of Palestinians to advance war and ethnic cleansing. And this question becomes one of how disparate are the left and the right? And we can agree to disagree on that to a certain extent, although I think we mostly agree that the difference between them is perhaps less than people make it out to be. But I just want to switch gears here, because I'm aware that we're almost out of time for the formal Q&A, for the formal conversation, and then we're going to open it up to our audience. I just want to ask you if you were surprised by the ferocity of Israel's response to October 7th. And because already in 6 months, you talk about how roughly 1% of the population of Palestinians on one hand and Jews on the other hand, 1% of the population of each of the populations dies during the 20 months of fighting. And already over 1% of Palestinians in Gaza have been killed in just 6 months. And there's obviously much, much more carpet bombing and devastation of institutions than existed in 1948, although many institutions were destroyed and there was plenty of bombing. So are you surprised by the ferocity of Israel's response to October 7th? And how do we account for it? And so some of the things that I was thinking about that would help to explain the ferocity of Israel's response and the difference between 1948 and 2023 is the extent of US unconditional support, the far right populist turn around the world. Israel has never really been held to account for its war crimes in the past, and so it has been emboldened over the years. You mentioned the use of advanced technology. And then finally, I think one factor that may be a part of it, and it is surely a part of it, is the fact that over time, Palestinians still have not disappeared. They have not left. And this infuriates the Israeli government because they had hoped to be rid of the Palestinian question. So I'm wondering if you can reflect on that, how we get from 1948 to 2023 and what you think about the
and first of all, yes, I was surprised. I mean, and I know it's repeated a lot, but for me personally, I've worked on this as a journalist and now an academic for essentially every day since I turned 17 and a half. To hear the state of Israel mentioned in the context of genocide as a plausible perpetrator, and not the kind of way that we often talk about genocide as a victim or Jews as a victim, is something that I did not imagine will happen ever in my lifetime. And I've definitely had colleagues and friends that are said for years that this is where this is gearing up to, because there are no other alternatives, and there are no, with the collapse of anything resembling any political solution of any sorts. But personally, yes, I was surprised, and when I tried to explain where we are today, I think there are a few things that we need to take into account. One of which is the role of the army. So there's sociologist Yagi Levy has been arguing for many years that the high command of the IDF, the chief of staff, and some of the top officers have very little control of what he called the occupation army in the West Bank. I think there's some of that at play today, not to reduce from the responsibility of the heads of the army and their culpability in war crimes, etc., but that this idea that there's this policy that is being made in the headquarters in Tel Aviv. It absolutely has an impact on what goes on in Gaza, but then, of course, the soldiers' conduct is also in some ways separated and is not entirely adherent or subject to that control and command. But the other thing is, I think that the army, if you look at the army's conduct in the last, let's say, 25 years, and again, I understand that it may not always look like that, but the army was relatively restraining factor on the Israeli political elite that often sought to, do a much more extensive ethnic cleansing of various sorts. But after the October 7th unbelievable blunder and fiasco in defending Israeli civilians, around Gaza, right? The army now needs to prove that they are not entirely incompetent. And so they have signed on this mass project of disseminating essentially the Gaza Strip and of revenge, of whatever you want to call that. And I think that's partly to explain what we're seeing, right? Of course, a part of that, and we already mentioned that, is this largely dehumanization of specifically Gaza, Palestinians at large, but certainly Gaza since 2005, this idea that you will create an open air jail and you don't need to think about that anymore. And, that kind of, I think, large dehumanization project is also explaining the kind of response that we're seeing now. I also mentioned earlier, the kind of this idea that only a response in kind to the perceived threat of elimination of Jews in the area is an appropriate answer to what we saw in October 7. And so I think that all these together may begin to explain what we're seeing today, which is, I do think it's a second Nakba in the sense that, you know, the magnitude of destruction, of displacement, of killing, right? So, you know, I would sometimes speak to my colleagues in the history department who work on other genocides and wars, etc. And they used to say, well, you know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I know this is your entire world, but when you look at the numbers of those killed over the years compared to those killed in other conflicts, the numbers are not very, very high. But that's changed now. That's really, really, really changed. And so I think we are in a yeah, it is part of a trajectory, but it is also its own sort of second Nakba that I don't see any prospects of it, you know, being resolved, improved in the immediate future, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. On that horrible note, Mona, do you want to take over and field some of these questions?
Sure. Thanks for a really sobering but interesting talk today, Shay. So great. We have some questions. The first one is a question about how appropriate it is to speak of Israel as a European settler colonial project, when the majority of today's Israeli population are descendants of the roughly 900,000 Jews who were forcibly expelled from throughout the Arab world in 1948 and had to flee to the then newly established Jewish state. So,
yeah. I mean, I think that you cannot understand the Zionist movement among other framework, but in the framework of settler colonialism, right? And certainly, you know, in my class that I teach on the emergence of Zionism and Israel-Palestine conflict, you know, we do this exercise where we look at Zionism and we list some pieces of evidence that will make it not a great fit to the settler colonial framework, most famously the question of having a metropole of the kind that we know from French Algeria, etc., and then the evidence that would support the use of the framework of settler colonialism for the study of Zionism. In my view, that column of evidence in support of the use of the framework is far, far more significant than the one than some of the possible challenges in the classical interpretations of this idea. For specifically this question of Jews from Arab lands who come mostly in the 50s and all the way to the 60s, right? So most of Moroccan Jews only come in the 60s. I don't think it destabilizes the origin of the movement, and certainly not its current practice, from being a settler colonial one, right? I mean, we are in a place that was established in the result of the settler colonial project, and obviously Canada, Australia, many others. But the fact that there were waves of immigration later from people who may not fit the category, who were not part of the initial colonization, does not weaken the comparison, right? So in late 19th century, Artur Rupin, one of the first and foremost Zionist leaders, who is the head of the Zionist organization in Palestine, he basically says, you know, yeah, we need to replicate a model that he knew from his he was born in Poznan, today Poland, that was then part of a settler colony of Germany, right? And so, you know, he basically said, we want to do what the Germans are doing in Poznan and parts of Prussia in Palestine itself. We want to reduce the native population, the Arab population, as much as we can, and basically create a Jewish majority country in this country, just the way the Germans were aiming to do in those areas of Poznan under Bismarck in the late 19th century before World War I. And so you see all these Zionist officials that are clearly stating, yeah, that's the project that we're aiming to do. We're doing it under the sponsorship of a larger empire, right? The British Empire. So that may fit that metropole colony connection, not in the immediate ways that we see in French Algeria, but in some ways, right? So the British, for much of their colonization of Palestine, right, from the end of World War I until 1948, are providing the muscle, right? So there's no doubt that without British protection and the Royal Air Force, right, bombs Palestinian villages during the 36 revolt to crush down what was until this point the world's largest and most significant anti-colonial revolt. And so the British are allowing Zionist colonization in the country, which then, of course, later on, after the British changed their policy in the 40s, the Zionists themselves are able to stand on their own, create a strong military force, and essentially even further or bring that depopulation of the country and the dispossession of its Arab population to that climax that we see in 1948. So that's a long answer to the question of I don't see the particular relevance of the immigration of massive waves of Jews from Arab lands into this, whether or not Zionism should be analyzed among other frameworks in that framework of settler colonialism. Shira, do you want to add something to that? You're muted.
I have nothing to add.
Thank you, Shay. We have a question here about the reaction to your book in Israel.
Yeah, thank you for this. So the book will be coming out in Hebrew in the next few months. And in fact, we are going to distribute it to educators and teachers in Israel for free who may be interested in looking at some different stories and histories. So there has not been a lot of responses because the book has not been published in Hebrew, aside from that exchange I had with a columnist. There was also a documentary called The Soldier's Opinion that is, I should say, loosely based on the research from the book, which was released in Israeli and broadcast in Israeli television a year or two ago. It garnered a lot of interest and attention, some hostile, some more positive. And we'll see how the release of the book in Hebrew plays out in current Israeli politics. I'm sure it may be challenging, but if a few high school students find it and read it and have their own questions and then Google them and look for answers for them, I would feel really happy and content.
Okay, we have two questions from the same person, so I'm just going to combine them. Is there an ability for Israelis to assign the atrocities of October 7th to Hamas instead of all Palestinians? And along with that, they have heard that people say that Palestine is not a country. Did they ever have a place of their own?
So I just want to make sure to understand the first question. Can you repeat that first question? I just want to make sure.
So this was written while you were still talking. The question is there I think they're asking if Israelis can differentiate between Hamas and Palestinians.
Yeah, and I think sadly that's not the reality that we see, in any way, shape, or form, right? And we see that in TikTok videos posted by Israeli soldiers and in that glee of the destruction. I mean, it's truly apocalyptic in ways that are unbelievable of Gaza Strip, right? And so there is no distinction. Now, we saw some shift in the propaganda coming out and that, what the chief of staff of the army is saying and some of its judicial officials, they are now, after some US and international pressure, are more careful to distinguish between the two. But even Israeli officials and army commanders and such, in the immediate aftermath of October 7, right, and the month leading from it, had basically, and including Israeli president, etc., had made no distinction or very little distinction between Hamas and Palestinians and Gazans more broadly. And I think that is also a major contributor to the, not just the destruction and carnage, but also to the disregard and really lack of interest in that among many Israelis and certainly in the Israeli media. And that's not how things always used to be. And that's really why I'm especially pessimistic about this current moment. Now, there was another part of the question about whether Palestine qualifies as a country. And sure, if you want to step in any of those, please feel free. I would say that, that people often ask me, in fact, just someone asked me last night in an event, oh, when is the first time the Palestinians call themselves Palestinians? And then I told them that I'm happy to answer that because there is an answer to that. It's sometimes after World War I. But what is the purpose of this question, right? Because for this question often to be asked, the underlying assumption is that, until they check a specific box in a Benedict Anderson checklist, that they should not be considered a legitimate nation, and therefore anything, quote unquote, done to that population is not done in the context of a conflict, and it's not really taking their land because they're not a people, etc. All that seems, I cannot literally fathom that because, we know from this context of North America, right, how settler colonialism looks like here and even how it looks like in Algeria, right? When French occupation in Algeria starts, there is no clearly conceived Algerian nation, but there is a kind of a sense of a shared identity of the indigenous population there that is against forces coming from the outside and gradually siphoning their land, their resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that we see in all sorts of ways in the late 19th and 20th century. Now, the moment that they call themselves Palestinians, right, and what the context of that is, we can talk more, right? British colonization, the end of World War I, the division of the Middle East to what we know today are the states of the Middle East. But I don't see how that retracts, because already in the late 19th century, we have farmers, Arab farmers in Palestine that are resisting their dispossession from their land, right? And so whether they're resisting it under the banner of being the indigenous or of being Palestinians, I honestly don't see the importance of distinction of that. And so that's why when often I ask that, I ask, why are you asking? And I hope I conveyed some of the underlying issues pertaining to that question.
Great, thank you. The next two questions are from our graduate students. So the first one is, thanks for this great talk, Professor Hazkani. Can you speak a little bit about the contemporary challenges of archival access for scholars of Israel-Palestine and whether that's impacted your work? And I know you have a good answer to this one.
Yeah, so I've been really interested for many years on the question of archival access and archival declassification. I even went to the Israeli Supreme Court against the Shin Bet to try and convince them to open their archives to scholars. And here's a spoiler, it did not work. But, first of all, we need to understand that the Palestinian archives in its most concrete way is subsumed in the Israeli archive, right? So just a couple of years ago, I found out that this, so in 1949, in Gaza, actually, the Palestinian leadership announced something they called the All-Palestine Government, Hukumat Umum Palestine, and they say, we have now declared a state under the auspices of the Egyptians that will control all of Palestine. Not much comes out of it, but, they do issue passports, and those passports can actually be found even today. And they generated a lot of documents of what is the vision for this Palestinian states. And a couple of years ago, when looking at this, after fighting for several years, I got a chunk of the catalog of the Israel State Archives that was not part of the official catalog. So something that people couldn't even see existed. And I got that, and I was looking, and I saw that's all the files of the old Palestine government, and they're in the Israeli archives, together with tens of thousands of other files of Arab Palestine, because the erasure of Arab Palestine, right, also entailed the confiscation and the looting of its documents and archives. And they are still today in the Israeli archive. Some of them are accessible, some of them are not. And, you know, obviously the state, especially in the last few years, is increasingly concerned about allowing access to those sources. And I think, you know, it feels a little silly at this moment to be talking about archives, but that's something that I think is still important, right? If we are to envision a future that is less violent and one in which some form of peace and justice are realized, I think those questions of archives, of those sources, of those stories will have an important place. And so this is certainly an ongoing thing. And of course, I was really privileged because as an Israeli Jew, I could access those places, those archives that many that are barred from entering Israel are not allowed to access. I also have a better sort of understanding of what there is out there and what one could do to fight and gain access to that. And in fact, my new research project will look at some of these questions of archives, archival access, and what are in those archives of quote unquote Arab Palestine.
Great, thanks. The next question is also from our graduate student. What role, if any, did myths, mainly primordial, play in the indoctrination of both sides?
Yeah, you know, it's a fascinating question. I don't know. In my view, you know, I was obviously, well, not obviously, but I was trained initially in like the, you know, Islamic history, etc., and later on made my way into Jewish history. And I always saw those texts, right, like these the Hebrew Bible, the Quran, and Hadith, in some ways as a marketplace where one could find whatever they need in a particular moment for their political purposes. And that's in the context of indoctrination. And so, you know, there's this very interesting hadith that is often used today by Islamist organization and obviously used by Daesh, ISIS, and also used by Hamas and others about the day of judgment in which the stones will turn and will say, you know, a Jew is behind me, go and kill that Jew, right? And that is that's a hadith, a sahih, a hadith that is considered reliable from I think the 9th century. But for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, probably until the 18th century, it is basically used very sparsely or almost not at all in all sorts of contexts in sort of the Islamic world, broadly speaking. And then in a particular moment, in a particular time, with the rise of nationalism, also of Zionism, but of Arab nationalism, that kind of text are excavated and are used for all sorts of, sadly, mostly murderous and other purposes. The same goes for the Hebrew Bible, right? The question of the Amalek and the 7 nations of Canaan, right, in the vast literature produced by rabbinical authorities, primarily in Eastern Europe, but also in the Middle East, they are almost not discussed at all, under the assumption that those ancient nemesis of the Israelites have long gone, and that there are no relevant parallels between them and whatever contemporary rivals or whatever of Jews. But in a particular moment in time, first in 1948, and then on steroids after 1967, those kinds of traditions are brought forward because they're seen as this a very, very useful tool for dehumanization. And of course, Israel is the much, much stronger party. At present, that kind of dehumanization and racialization more broadly has much, much more severe, much more profound consequences of the kind that we see today.
Great. Thank you for this incredibly thoughtful conversation. I know the focus of the book is people's letters from the moment and the propaganda that was directed to them during the war, but do you have a sense, either from research or more general observation, on how soldiers lived over time with the atrocities that they were part of?
Yeah, so that kind of that first of all, the descent surfaces already in 48, and I would argue that it surfaces again into the 1950s or so, and less so from the 60s onwards, with some exceptions. And I think, and Shay and I have a disagreement on this. I do think that Messianic and religious Zionism are one of the primary reasons their rise to power, starting in 67, but obviously much more significantly in recent decades, are one of the primary reasons where Israel has not really sought to grapple with that sort of ancestral sin, or whatever you want to call that, of 1948. Because here, in that story of Israel's birth and the erasure of Arab Palestine through the form of ethnic cleansing, is not necessarily very, very unique in the context, certainly, of the world we live in today, even in modern times. But what is, I don't know if unique necessarily, but what distinguishes our current moment, and when I say current, I mean the last few decades, in Israel, is really almost entire refusal to grapple with it, with the exception of some, NGOs and others that are trying to bring that to the fore. And I think that one of the reasons when that's not grappled with almost at all is the entrenchment of Messianic and religious Zionism in the Israeli society, something we don't have much time to talk about here, but I'm hoping to write and theorize that a little bit more in the future.
So in a post-6-day war book composed of letters from Israeli soldiers, many write about the internal conflicts they experienced in the fighting.
Yeah.
They've forgotten the name of the book, you may know it, but did you find any letters of this type, a wrestling with conscience, or any letters that were less negative or had less of a dehumanizing nature?
No, absolutely. That's important to note. I mean, there's all sorts of things, especially in that early period, right? There is some serious dissent among Israeli soldiers to that indoctrination, and certainly of those coming from outside. One of the groups that I really follow closely are American Jews, right? About several thousands of them come and volunteer in the 1948 war, and some certainly see that is a second chance of saving their Jewish brother, and that they may have not been able to do during the Second World War. And their story for many decades in the US and elsewhere has been celebrated. There's even a film made, I think, by Spielberg's daughter about those volunteers. They're called Mahal volunteers. But the letters that I looked at actually suggest that there was very significant disenchantment among some of those American Jewish volunteers who come to Israel to fight and witness, right, the war, the atrocities, the erasure of Arab Palestine. I'll give this one example, this letter that I really like. I think it really reverberates and echoes a lot of what we're now seeing and witnessing among American Jews, or among some factions of them, right? So one of those volunteers, he goes to Israel, he volunteers in the army, and then towards the end of 1948, he writes his parents back in the US, and he says, I want to come back immediately. And this is what he says. He says, a golem is being formed here, and no one knows how it would turn when it grows. And we, American Jews, helped to create this golem, but without having any say on its moves. At any rate, the Jews of Israel abandoned their religion for a revolver in every respect. And he mentioned here this term golem. Golem is a mythical creature from the Middle Ages that, according to tradition, was erected by a very famous rabbi, the Maharal of Prague, in order to protect Jews, Jewish community from nearby Christian worshippers were planning to do a pogrom. So it's kind of a kind of a Frankenstein figure. So he erects this golem, and it then protects the Jewish community of Prague. And at the aftermath of that tradition, the golem starts running wild, killing and injuring innocent bystanders. And so the golem became this symbol for unchecked sort of violence. And so what this person is saying is that, American Jews helped create this golem ostensibly to protect Jews and Holocaust survivor, etc. But it then sort of starts running wild, adopting militarism, right? What he calls the abandoning of the religion for a revolver. And so we see that descent, and this person went back to the US disenchanted. And I do think that, in the context of the current moment, I don't know if that's optimistic necessarily, because my attention is really laser focused on the place itself and less so on the cause. But we do see this unbelievable change in American Jewish population, especially the younger generation. That, I came to the US 16, 17 years ago, and I met you for the first time, and, I couldn't even imagine something like that would happen. But we are seeing it now. What that means for the place itself, and whether, all we have to hope for, or not hope for, but all we have to, that we'll see there is more carnage and, this zero-sum game. I hope it somehow translates into a less violent future there. I can see now how that unfolds, but I was proven wrong more than one time. So hopefully I'll be proven wrong again here.
We've got time for just one more question. So this one is asking you about your film. So there's a move in anthropology towards multimodal forms of research and publication. Can you comment on the film that you produced in relation to your book and why you decided to work on a connected film project? And what are the possibilities and challenges that are posed by this approach?
Yeah, well, the film directed by this amazing director, Asaf Banit, an Israeli, and produced in Israel, it was a very challenging, very long process. I had, left journalism and, covering, I was a correspondent in the occupied territory throughout much of the Second Intifada. I realized by the end of the 7 years covering that region that the view from the ground is important, but some, larger context is also really, really essential. And so that's why I ended up leaving journalism and embarking on an academic career. But it was always important to me to tell those stories outside of the important and wonderful circles of academia. And so in trying to transform an academic book still into a documentary film in Israel, I was hoping to be able to tell some of those stories in a different medium. That entailed a lot of compromises and a lot of challenges, right? Because this is, a several hundred book, and you end up producing a 55-minute film. Whether that captures what it captures, there's this, it's a big question. This was all in the pre-October 7 world. So now a lot of my thinking has changed in some ways, but, I was hoping that some of that story of 1948 and even the period after that could be rendered to larger audience through that film. For a second there, I came back from August from Israel, from a visit there, after seeing obviously the massive mobilization and demonstration against the judicial overhaul, and those were not pertaining to the Israeli occupation or what largely is seen as an apartheid regime. However, within those demonstrations, there were also, not sure, thousands, maybe more, Israeli Jews demonstrating against apartheid and occupation. That's more than I have ever seen in the context of mobilization of Israeli Jews against that system of apartheid. And I always thought that the judicial overhaul, in the end of the day, was about the further colonization of the West Bank and the larger regime of apartheid, right? And so I came back, I don't want to say optimistic, but I thought, things are actually changing there as well. We all know what transpired later. And so some of my larger, I think, hopes of if people only, looked at stories in different ways and realized that the stories are more complicated than they may think, I'm not sure I believe in that in the same kind of way, but I do think it's important to make those kind of stories accessible to larger populations and of different kinds and kids in school and all that.
Thank you so much, Shay and Shira, for such a rich conversation. We have 1 minute remaining, and I will use that to plug our 3 upcoming events. The first is a Middle East Policy Forum discussion with Steve Cole on his new book, The Achilles Trap: Saddam Hussein, the CIA, and the Origins of America's Invasion of Iraq, on April 16th at 1:30, both online and in the Elliott School 505. We are co-sponsoring the 2024 Max Tickton Memorial Lecture hosted with the Judaic Studies program. This is Derek Pensler, who will discuss global reactions to the partition of Palestine after the 1948 war. That's April 17th at 4 p.m. in the Gelman Library, 7th floor. And finally, our 2024 IMIS annual conference, Middle East Knowledge Production in the Aftermath of October 7th, will be April 19th, all day in Elliott School 602 and on Zoom. So we hope you'll be able to join us for one of those events. And thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, Shay and Shira, for this great conversation.
Privilege. Thank you so much, Shira, and thank you so much, Mona. It was really a great honor to be here with you.
Thank you, Shay. Thanks, Mona.
Take care.